ChatGPT said, as the wheels of the jetliner lifted off the tarmac. Mariah sat back in her seat, her fingers gripping the armrest, feeling the familiar hum of the aircraft as it ascended into the sky. It was a brief moment of silence, a rare instance of stillness in her life, but even as the noise of the world outside faded away, the weight of everything she carried remained. Mariah had earned her seat at the table. She had fought, clawed, and sacrificed to become the CEO of one of the largest tech companies in the world. For years, she had balanced the demands of an industry dominated by men, particularly white men, and worked tirelessly to prove herself, not just as a leader, but as someone who could shatter the glass ceilings placed above her since the very beginning of her career. She had worked weekends, pulled all-nighters, and faced down every stereotype and microaggression that sought to undermine her. Being a black woman in a position of power meant constantly navigating a landscape of doubt, of expectations far higher than those of her peers, of having her expertise questioned in ways that her counterparts never had to face. And yet, against all odds, she had risen to the top, steering her company to unprecedented heights. But the triumphs had come at a cost. As Mariah glanced out the window, watching the clouds stretch beneath her, she couldn't help but reflect on the internal battles she had faced every day to get to this point. The fight for recognition, the fight to be seen as more than just a token hire, the fight to prove that her achievements weren't mere anomalies but the result of skill, intelligence, and hard work. These battles weren't fought in the boardroom alone. They were fought in the hallways, in the meetings where she had been the only woman in the room, let alone the only black woman, where her ideas were dismissed until a white male colleague repeated them and was applauded. They were fought in the quiet moments before every speech she delivered, before every presentation, where the pressure of being both the face and the voice of change was almost too much to bear. She thought of the recent board meeting, where her proposal to diversify the company's leadership was met with passive resistance. It wasn't that anyone outright disagreed with her, rather, they subtly undermined her suggestion, questioning its feasibility and necessity despite the glaring evidence that such change was long overdue. It wasn't the first time she had faced this kind of dismissal, and it wouldn't be the last. She thought of the constant balancing act she performed each day, how she had to be confident without being arrogant, assertive without being perceived as angry, a leader without coming off as too controlling. She had learned early in her career that the bar was always set higher for women of color, that her every word and every decision would be scrutinized, and that a single misstep could jeopardize her credibility in a way it never would for her peers. But as much as the systemic barriers weighed heavily on her, what truly tested her strength was the loneliness that came with her position. She had become a symbol, an embodiment of success for so many who had never seen someone like her at the top. She carried the hopes of countless young women and men of color who looked to her and believed that they, too, could one day occupy positions of power. It was a mantle she bore with pride, but also with a quiet sorrow. The further she climbed, the fewer people she could truly trust, the fewer people who truly understood the complexity of her journey. And so, she often found herself alone, surrounded by people who respected her position but not necessarily her. Her phone buzzed in her bag, interrupting her thoughts. It was a text from her assistant, a reminder for the meeting she would attend upon landing. She sighed, tapping the message away before sliding the phone back into her purse. The tasks were never ending, the expectations never relenting. But there was a fire in her, one that refused to be extinguished, one that kept her pushing forward, even when every part of her body ached from the strain. As the plane cut through the clouds, Mariah thought of her mother, who had always believed in her even when the world doubted. Her mother had taught her that strength wasn't about never feeling the weight of the world, but about carrying it with grace and resilience. It was a lesson that had stayed with her, and it was what had kept her standing when everything inside her told her to quit. She thought of the young women she mentored, the ones who came to her for guidance, who asked how she had managed to push through the barriers, the ones who would one day replace her at the helm of their own companies. They were her motivation, her reason for continuing. For them, she could never give up. As the plane began its descent, Mariah straightened in her seat, her thoughts grounding her, preparing her for the next battle that awaited. The world might continue to question her leadership, might continue to challenge her authority, but she would not bend. She would rise, as she always had, with grace, with strength, and with an unwavering belief that her place at the top was not a fluke, but a triumph, hard-earned and well-deserved. Samantha Williams had flown first class countless times, her achievements as CEO of a major tech firm always earning her the privilege, the recognition, and, often, the quiet admiration of those around her. But today, as she stepped up to the gate agent at the airport, ready to board her flight for an important international meeting, she was met with a confused frown. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but your seat has been downgraded," the agent said, glancing down at her boarding pass and then back up at Samantha, almost as if trying to reconcile the information with her presence. "There seems to be a mistake." Samantha blinked, the words taking a moment to sink in. A mistake? She had been confirmed in first class, and the reservation was as clear as the day was long. She had received the confirmation email 2 days ago, the same way she had for every flight she'd ever taken. Her eyebrows furrowed, the calm that she had cultivated through years of leading a multi-billion-dollar company beginning to erode. "There's no mistake," Samantha replied, her voice steady, but her mind was already racing. "I'm in first class. You can check again." The agent hesitated, her eyes flicking to the computer screen before she glanced back at Samantha with an apologetic shrug. "I'm afraid you're listed for coach now, ma'am," she said, a slight emphasis on the word ma'am that stung more than Samantha could have expected. She felt a flush of heat rising in her chest, but she kept her composure, her mind frantically trying to make sense of the situation. Was this a mistake? Was she being punished for something? As she waited, the minutes felt like hours, her calm slipping further with each passing second. The agent eventually handed her a new boarding pass, with a clear demotion printed in black and white, "Coach." Samantha's heart skipped a beat. She had never been told no like this before, not by anyone, certainly not by an airline that valued its high-paying clients. But there it was, a simple act of rejection, seemingly so trivial in the grand scheme of things, yet profoundly personal. She had worked her entire life to get to this point, to be respected and recognized in a male-dominated, predominantly white industry. The weight of years of hard work, sacrifice, and perseverance bore down on her shoulders, and suddenly, it felt like it had all been swept aside with one dismissive gesture. She was no longer the CEO, the powerful, influential woman who commanded boardrooms with authority. She was just another woman, with dark skin and a name that didn't seem to fit the mold of the people they expected to fly first class. Samantha's hands clenched into fists, her nails pressing into her palms as she fought to remain composed, to not give in to the wave of humiliation that threatened to overwhelm her. She forced herself to smile at the agent, her voice now cool and polite. "I'd like to speak to your supervisor, please." The words felt hollow, as if saying them would change nothing, but she was determined to hold on to some semblance of dignity. She knew that this wasn't an isolated incident, it was the culmination of a pattern she had long been aware of, a subtle, insidious form of bias that reared its ugly head in the most unexpected places. She had faced it before at corporate meetings, in the halls of high-powered offices, in the tone of voices that sounded just a little too surprised when they learned she was the one in charge. It wasn't overt, not always, but it was there, and it made her feel like she was constantly fighting for a seat at the table she had earned. When the supervisor arrived, Samantha's frustration simmered just beneath the surface, but she kept her voice steady. She explained the situation again, her resolve hardening. She was used to advocating for herself, used to having her accomplishments questioned despite the undeniable proof of her success. And yet, even as she spoke, the supervisor's demeanor, a mix of condescension and feigned sympathy, was unmistakable. It was as though she were just one of many inconveniences in the supervisor's day, a minor glitch in an otherwise routine operation. "We understand your frustration, ma'am," the supervisor said, her words laced with polite indifference. "However, we have overbooked the first-class section, and we had to make adjustments. You were the last to check in, so..." She trailed off, leaving the explanation hanging in the air. Samantha's mind raced. Overbooked. She had checked in well ahead of time, and yet, here she was, downgraded and marginalized, left to fight for a spot that she had already earned. The humiliation of it hit her like a cold slap, but deeper than that was the realization that this was not just an isolated error, it was a symptom of a deeper, systemic issue. Her achievements were being undermined, not because she was incapable, not because she didn't deserve the respect she had worked so hard to earn, but because of the assumptions others made about who she was and where she belonged. The supervisor's words seemed to float in the air, meaningless in the face of Samantha's growing realization. She wasn't just fighting for a seat on this plane, she was fighting for her place in a world that seemed all too eager to strip her of her hard-won authority. The emotional weight of the moment threatened to crush her, but she refused to let it show. Instead, she nodded once, the mask of composure falling into place once again. "I'll take the coach seat," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but filled with the quiet strength of someone who had seen the worst of the world and still refused to be broken. The supervisor nodded, but Samantha knew that the truth was already clear. This wasn't a mistake. It was a reflection of the biases she had long fought to overcome, biases that continued to shape the way the world saw her, despite everything she had accomplished. As she walked toward the back of the plane, her heart heavy, she realized this moment would stay with her long after the flight was over. It would fuel the fire within her, the fire to change things, to make sure that no one, especially not women like her, ever had to fight for their seat again. Amina stood still in the center of the bustling airport terminal, her eyes locked on the departing figure of the CEO, who had just brushed past her without so much as a glance. The coldness of the moment hung heavy in the air, but Amina refused to let the sting of the snub show on her face. She had learned long ago that in this world, this corporate world, where her presence often felt like an afterthought, emotions were a luxury she could not afford. Her outward calm was a carefully constructed facade, one she had perfected over the years to protect herself from the subtle but persistent dismissals that came her way. As the CEO disappeared into the crowd, Amina's mind began to churn, her thoughts shifting between the quiet hurt that threatened to surface and the frustration that simmered beneath the surface. This is how it always goes, she thought. You fight tooth and nail for a seat at the table, for the chance to speak your truth, and yet, time and again, you find yourself being ignored, overlooked, as if you were invisible. The anger was there, just beneath the surface, but she had learned to bury it, to twist it into something useful, into resilience, into a quiet strength that kept her moving forward. Amina had earned every inch of her position, had fought through years of microaggressions, snide comments, and the weight of being one of the few black women in a room full of powerful, mostly white men. She had stayed late, worked harder, been smarter, only to be told time and again that she had to prove herself even more. She was no stranger to the endless cycle of striving, succeeding, and still being seen as less than. Her heart ached with the unfairness of it, but she had learned not to show it. The flight attendants, oblivious to the storm of emotions brewing within Amina, bustled around her in the cramped boarding area, their voices high and bright as they went about their duties. They moved with the fluid efficiency of people accustomed to the rhythm of travel, checking boarding passes, adjusting overhead compartments, and offering polite smiles to the growing crowd of passengers. They didn't see the woman standing just a few feet away, her hands clenched into fists by her sides, her shoulders tense as she held back tears of frustration. They didn't see the battle she fought every day, both in her professional life and within herself, to remain composed, to not let the constant invalidation break her spirit. Instead, the attendants exchanged casual remarks about their next flight, their eyes glazing over her like any other passenger. To them, Amina was just another face in the crowd, just another person waiting to board. They didn't know that every day, in every room, in every meeting, she had to work harder, be better, and speak louder just to be acknowledged. Why couldn't they see it? She thought bitterly. Why couldn't they understand? The weight of it all felt crushing. As she glanced around the terminal, she could see the indifference of the flight crew reflected in the faces of the other passengers. No one had any idea what she was going through. It was as though she were a ghost in her own life, constantly moving, constantly striving, but never fully seen. Her chest tightened, and she fought to steady her breathing. She would not cry, not here, not now. Not in front of these people who would never understand. Instead, she chose silence, her thoughts her only companion as she watched the attendants continue their work, unaware of the inner turmoil she battled. To them, the task at hand was simply another job to do. They didn't know the significance of this moment, of the rejection she had just faced. The moment was a small one, fleeting, insignificant to everyone but her, but it was the accumulation of years of small slights, microaggressions, and dismissals that had brought her to this point. Amina had walked into this airport that morning with the hope that today would be different, that this time, her presence, her voice, would be valued. Instead, she had been met with the same indifference, the same lack of recognition that she had faced countless times before. It was as if she had never truly existed in the space she had worked so hard to occupy. But I'm still here, she reminded herself, her resolve hardening. I have earned every step I've taken, and I will not let this moment define me. She straightened her back and exhaled slowly, pushing the frustration aside, burying it deep down where it would not show. The attendants continued to move around her, still unaware, still indifferent. But Amina knew, deep in her bones, that she was more than just this moment, more than the dismissals, more than the endless need to prove herself. She was stronger than this, and no matter how many times she had to endure being invisible, she would always rise again. She would continue to take her seat at the table, continue to speak her truth, even if no one seemed to listen. As the flight crew completed their work and began to board the passengers, Amina held her head high, her gaze steady, her composure unbroken. In the end, it wasn't the flight attendants who defined her, it was herself, and no one could take that away. The low hum of the plane's engines was a constant reminder of the altitude they had reached, but for Jamila, the feeling of being trapped in that cabin was far more suffocating than the physical confines of the aircraft. She had always prided herself on her composure, on her ability to remain unshaken in the face of adversity, but today, the weight of it all pressed down on her with an intensity that she wasn't prepared for. As she settled into her seat in economy, her eyes briefly scanning the first-class cabin just a few rows away, she could already sense the undercurrent of discomfort beginning to ripple through the air. The flight had been delayed, and as passengers shuffled past, their eyes briefly meeting hers, she caught more than a few skeptical glances. They weren't just looking at her, they were judging her. Some turned their heads quickly, as if surprised by her presence, while others exchanged whispers, their words too quiet to catch but unmistakable in their tone. She felt it before she even knew what it was, a shift in the air, a quiet assessment, as though she didn't belong here, in this moment, in this space. The truth was, she didn't belong to the world they expected her to. As a black woman, a CEO in an industry where leadership was still overwhelmingly white and male, she had learned to swallow the discomfort, to smile when it felt like her skin was too heavy, too visible. But today was different. Today, it wasn't just the usual microaggressions or dismissive comments in boardrooms that she had grown used to. Today, it was in the subtle way the passengers glanced at her, as if she had somehow tricked the system, as if she had somehow crossed a line that wasn't meant to be crossed. The flight attendant approached, her smile tight as she asked Jamila if she would be comfortable with the seat, and Jamila gave a polite nod, though inside, her stomach was churning. It wasn't about the seat, not really. It wasn't even about the missed first-class upgrade that she had been hoping for. It was about the weight of expectation, the constant feeling of being underestimated, of being looked at as something lesser. She had worked her entire life to get to this point, to break the barriers that had been set before her, and yet, in this small moment on a crowded flight, she felt the sting of every prejudice she had ever faced. She could sense the CEO of a competing firm seated just a few rows ahead, his laugh carrying above the low murmur of the cabin, a reminder of the world she was often made to feel like an outsider in. His eyes met hers for a moment, and she felt a flicker of recognition, a brief glimmer of acknowledgement. But it was quickly followed by a cold, dismissive glance, as though his gaze was saying, "I didn't expect you here." The tension in the cabin seemed to intensify with every passing minute. Jamila could feel the heat of their stares, even as she kept her focus trained on the soft hum of the seat belt sign above her. She knew she wasn't imagining it. There was something about the way the passengers watched her, some casting doubtful glances her way, as if wondering how someone like her had ended up in the same space as them. It wasn't just a matter of class or status, it was deeper than that. It was the unspoken message that, despite all her accomplishments, despite the titles she had earned and the doors she had opened, she would always be an anomaly in their eyes. Her mind flashed to the countless board meetings where she had been the only woman in the room, the only person of color, where every decision, every word, had been weighed against a different set of standards. The moments when her voice had been drowned out by others, when her ideas were dismissed before they had the chance to breathe, when she had been told, time and time again, that she had to work twice as hard to be seen as half as capable. And now, here she was, in this cabin, on this flight, facing the same thing again, the doubt, the discomfort, the unspoken questioning of her place in a world that had never fully embraced her. She felt the weight of the choice in front of her, to speak up, to call out the undercurrent of prejudice that lingered just beneath the surface, or to swallow it down once more, to endure, to silently bear the weight of their discomfort, as she had so many times before. Her breath caught in her throat as the CEO of the competing firm, still unaware of the toll his casual dismissals had on her, laughed louder, as though his presence was a validation in itself. She wondered for a moment if he would even remember her name if they met in a professional setting, or if she would always just be the woman who didn't quite belong. Her fingers tightened around the armrest, and her thoughts swirled. Could she speak up without coming across as defensive? Could she challenge their assumptions without losing her place in a world that was so quick to reject her? The moment felt like it could tip in any direction, the weight of the situation pressing down on her, suffocating her with every passing second. Finally, she exhaled, slow and deliberate, reminding herself that her worth had never been defined by their gaze, never been tethered to their perceptions. She had fought too hard, too long, to let this moment define her. Yet, in the silence that followed, as the hum of the plane grew louder and the world around her continued as though nothing had changed, Jamila realized something that would stay with her forever. Sometimes, silence was a kind of resistance, too. She leaned back, closed her eyes, and allowed the discomfort to wash over her, knowing that she was stronger than the judgment she would continue to face. The cabin of the flight was eerily silent, the hum of the engines only amplifying the tension that had been building in the air. Sarah, the CEO of a powerful corporation, sat stiffly in her seat, her hands clenched tightly on the armrests as she stared straight ahead. For the past few hours, she had been enduring whispered comments from the passengers around her, a discomfort that she was accustomed to. People often seemed to treat her differently when they learned who she was. But today, something was different. A subtle shift in the way the staff was looking at her, the way they moved around her, left her feeling like she was a stranger in a place she thought she controlled. The flight attendants had been unusually tense, their smiles polite but distant, as if they were walking on eggshells around her. She could feel their discomfort radiating toward her, and though she tried to focus on the in-flight magazine, the whispers continued to slide across her consciousness, cutting deeper than she cared to admit. Then, the door to the cockpit opened, and the flight officer appeared in the aisle, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on Sarah. She froze, her breath catching in her throat as he moved toward her. "Miss Lawson, if I could have a word with you," he said, his tone polite yet firm, the words clipped with an authority that instantly made her stomach churn. A brief flicker of confusion passed across Sarah's face as she glanced at the flight attendants who were now standing by, looking uncomfortable but resolute. One of them, a young woman who had been serving drinks earlier, stepped forward and addressed her softly but with a professionalism that felt like an undercurrent of urgency. "Ma'am, we would like to escort you to a different seat." The words hit her like a cold slap, and for a moment, she couldn't comprehend what was happening. She opened her mouth to protest, to remind them of who she was, of the power her title held, but the flight officer's gaze remained unwavering, and the attendants' eyes, though apologetic, were filled with a sense of finality. The entire situation, this sudden shift in how they saw her, was jarring, uncomfortable, something she wasn't used to. "There's been a complaint," the officer continued, his voice lowering, though it did nothing to soothe the bubbling discomfort in Sarah's chest. "It's nothing personal, of course, but we feel it's best for the comfort of everyone on board." His words, though seemingly neutral, were heavy with something unspoken, and for the first time in years, Sarah felt something she had never truly allowed herself to feel: vulnerability. The acknowledgement that her presence, her authority, and her position, things that she had once wielded so confidently, were now in question. The flight attendants exchanged glances, their discomfort palpable. One of them, an older woman with graying hair, stepped closer, speaking in a quieter tone. "We're just following protocol," she said, as if trying to ease the sting, but the apology in her voice only made Sarah feel more exposed, more raw. It was as if the very foundations of her identity were being challenged, not by the passengers who were silent now, their gazes fixed on the scene unfolding, but by the staff, by the system itself, that had once served her without question. The weight of the moment settled on her like a heavy coat, suffocating in its heat. The fight that had long lived within her, the drive to prove herself, to make her voice heard in a world where her gender and position had often been undermined, now seemed futile. This wasn't just a seat assignment, it was a reflection of something much larger, a systemic force that sought to diminish her at every turn. The flight officer's intervention, while necessary in his eyes, symbolized an ongoing battle against the biases and oppressive structures that women like her had spent their lives navigating. She could feel her heart race, her throat tightening, the words she wanted to say caught somewhere between anger and disbelief. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She had worked too hard, fought too many battles, for this kind of treatment, this kind of undermining of her authority, not just from her peers, but from a system that was supposed to serve her. For a brief moment, she felt small, diminished in a way she hadn't felt in years. The flight officer and attendants, despite their professionalism, could not mask the discomfort in their actions, the clear indication that they felt this was a necessary step. As they stood before her, waiting for her to comply, Sarah realized something profound. This wasn't about the seat, or the complaint, or even the flight. This was about her struggle to hold onto her power in a world that constantly tried to strip it away. Her emotions, once simmering beneath the surface, began to bubble over with a quiet intensity. The realization hit her hard, like a slap to the face. No matter how high she climbed, no matter how much she achieved, there would always be moments where her authority was questioned, her position scrutinized, simply because of who she was, because of her gender, because of her presence in a world not designed for her. As the attendants waited for her to move, the weight of the moment hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. The tension in the cabin was palpable, a quiet storm that slowly churned beneath the surface, unnoticed at first but impossible to ignore as the minutes ticked by. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting between one another, trying to make sense of the scene unfolding before them. At first, it seemed like just another delay, another minor inconvenience to add to the long list of frustrations that came with air travel. But as the flight attendants moved swiftly through the aisles, their expressions strained, and a few murmurs of concern rippled through the rows, it became clear that something was wrong. Some passengers exchanged curious glances, eyebrows raised in quiet speculation, while others simply stared ahead, doing their best to ignore the growing unease that had begun to settle over the cabin like a heavy fog. But the real shift came when the CEO, once an immovable force in her industry, a woman accustomed to commanding rooms, was physically escorted down the aisle by two security officers. The sight of her, normally so composed and dignified, now walking like a criminal, her head slightly bowed and her shoulders tense, ignited a silent wave of shock and confusion among the passengers. There was a collective breath held in the cabin as the realization set in that this was not a simple misunderstanding or a routine security check. The woman who had once stood at the top of a vast empire, her every word commanding attention, was now being treated like a troublemaker, her dignity stripped away with every step. It was an emotional conflict that simmered in the air, and though no one dared to speak, the undercurrent of judgment and discomfort was undeniable. Some passengers seemed to take a kind of voyeuristic pleasure in the spectacle, their curiosity piqued by the drama unfolding in front of them, while others looked away, not wanting to be complicit in what felt like an unfair public shaming. A few whispered, their voices low but laced with speculation, trying to make sense of what had just happened. How could someone like her, so powerful and poised, be reduced to this? How had she gone from sitting in first class, untouchable and dignified, to this? It was a challenge to the very notion of authority that made them all uncomfortable, a reminder that even the highest in society could be brought low, that power, once assumed to be unshakable, could slip away with the slightest misstep. And then there was the CEO herself. As she moved down the aisle, her expression faltered, her usual air of control slipping away with each step. She had always been in control, always. She had worked her entire life to command respect, to create an identity that no one could challenge, no one could question. But now, as she was escorted like a criminal, the weight of scrutiny fell heavily on her shoulders, and the tightness in her chest grew unbearable. This wasn't just an inconvenience. This was a public challenge to her authority, a direct attack on her dignity. For the first time in years, she felt small, so small. The faces around her, the whispered conversations, the uncomfortable glances, they all felt like daggers aimed at her. She could feel the weight of each gaze, the judgment, the disappointment, and it was more suffocating than any boardroom battle she had ever fought. She had spent so long at the top, never once considering the possibility of being vulnerable, of being humiliated. But now, as she walked under the weight of every eye in the cabin, the sense of powerlessness that washed over her was overwhelming. What had happened? How had she gone from being someone to be feared to someone to be watched with disdain? She had been just like any other passenger at first, unaware of the events that had led to this moment, but now it felt as if the walls were closing in on her. There was nowhere to hide, no place to run. The eyes of the passengers followed her, their curiosity mingling with a strange kind of discomfort. And in that moment, she realized something that shook her to the core: there was nothing worse than losing control in front of a crowd, nothing more vulnerable than having the very essence of your authority questioned in the public eye. She could feel the sting of her own pride, her professional identity crumbling beneath the weight of this unexpected humiliation. How long had she spent building her reputation, her brand, her life around the idea of being unshakable, only for it to be shattered so easily? It wasn't just the walk down the aisle that was painful, it was the silence, the uncertainty, the way everything she had worked for now felt so fragile. With every step she took, the emotional undercurrent grew stronger, a rising tide of discomfort that no one could avoid, not even her. And the passengers, those silent witnesses to her fall from grace, could only watch as the woman who had once commanded respect now struggled to keep her dignity intact in the face of scrutiny. In the silence of her office, the CEO sat at her desk, staring out the window, her mind racing with conflicting thoughts, each one a burden that weighed heavier than the last. The events of the day replayed in her mind, a culmination of years of quiet resistance, systemic bias, and the invisible walls that had always been just slightly out of her reach, too far to shatter, but close enough to make every step forward feel like a struggle. She had built her career on resilience, on the quiet strength that had pushed her through countless battles, each one leaving its mark on her soul, shaping her into the larger-than-life figure that others admired but could never fully understand. She had spent decades fighting, not just for her place at the table, but for the very right to be seen as worthy, as capable, as human. And yet, time and time again, the world had refused to recognize her humanity, instead elevating her to a pedestal where the expectations were so high, and the stakes so immense, that the smallest misstep could send it all crumbling down. Today was different, though. The injustice she had quietly endured for so long had come to a head, and for the first time in years, she felt a deep, unshakable urge to fight back. But as she considered the consequences of speaking out, of exposing the very system that had once rewarded her for her silence, a wave of mental fatigue washed over her. She had been the larger-than-life figure for so long, the one who held it all together, the one who rose above every obstacle with grace and strength, who never allowed herself to falter. But behind that image, there was a woman exhausted from the constant battle, a woman who had long since stopped being able to tell where the weight of the world ended and where her own soul began. She had kept her head down, been the quiet leader, the one who kept pushing forward despite the bias, the prejudice, the whispers in the boardroom, the subtle comments behind her back, the assumption that she had only made it because of luck, or worse, because of her gender, her race, her differences. She had smiled through it all, played the game, and risen higher than anyone thought possible. But now, sitting alone in her office, she wondered if it had all been worth it. The thought of fighting back, of standing up against the very system that had shaped her success, made her heart race with a mix of fear and exhilaration. She had spent so many years protecting her image, controlling her narrative, and now, the idea of unleashing her truth felt both terrifying and liberating. Would the world finally understand her? Would they finally see her not as the cold, unfeeling executive they assumed her to be, but as the woman who had sacrificed so much so many years, so many parts of herself just to be heard, just to matter? The question of whether to expose the injustice or remain silent gnawed at her, the decision seemingly so simple, yet infinitely complex. She could continue as she always had, putting on the mask of strength, hiding her vulnerability behind carefully crafted words and gestures, and allowing the system to continue as it always had. But would that be enough? Would she be able to live with herself, knowing that she had chosen to be complicit in the very thing that had held her back for so long? She knew that if she spoke out, if she finally let the world see the cracks in her armor, everything would change. The board would react. The shareholders would question her leadership. Her career, everything she had worked for, could be at risk. Yet, as she thought of the countless women and people of color who had been forced to endure the same struggles, who had silently borne the weight of systemic bias in every corner of their lives, she wondered how much longer she could stay silent. She had risen to the top, yes, but at what cost? Was it worth it to be the bigger person, to rise above the injustices that had built the very system she had climbed, only to realize that, in doing so, she had allowed that system to continue hurting others? The decision was hers alone, and she felt the weight of it pressing on her chest, the gravity of the moment undeniable. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had ever been overlooked, ignored, or pushed aside because they didn't fit into the narrow mold of success. She could keep carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders, continue to be the untouchable figure who somehow made it to the top, or she could fight back, risk it all, and try to change the very system that had tried to break her. The thought of giving up the carefully constructed image she had built over the years terrified her, but it also ignited something deep inside her, a sense of power she had never allowed herself to feel. For so long, she had been afraid to let go of the control, to let the world see her as vulnerable, to show that she, too, was human. But maybe it was time to stop being the untouchable, to stop carrying the weight alone. Maybe it was time to speak up, to stand tall, and to remind the world that real strength didn't come from being perfect, it came from having the courage to be broken and still keep moving forward. Her decision was clear now, but the road ahead remained uncertain. She was no longer just a leader in the boardroom, she was a woman on the edge of a transformation that could change not just her life, but the lives of everyone who followed in her wake. And in that moment, she knew that whatever came next, she would face it head on, no longer willing to hide behind the walls of silence and fear. The moment the confrontation between CEO Richard Dalton and the young woman, Maya, had erupted, the atmosphere in the plane shifted. At first, there was confusion. Whispers passed through the cabin like an electrical current, each passenger unsure of what was happening. Maya, standing in the aisle, her voice shaking yet fierce as she called out Dalton's disregard for others and his behavior toward a fellow passenger, had become the spark that ignited a chain reaction. The chaos didn't explode immediately, it grew in waves. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, caught between a deep-seated respect for authority and the unsettling reality of witnessing a man they once revered brought low by someone they perceived as beneath him. A few spoke up in defense of Dalton, justifying his actions, dismissing Maya's claims as an exaggeration, and even accusing her of seeking attention. Their words dripped with the ingrained biases that, for so long, had dictated how power was viewed: those who had it, those who were supposed to have it, and those who were expected to stay silent in its presence. Others, though, felt the tension of the moment stir something deeper in their hearts. Maya's courage resonated with them, the silence they'd lived under for years now broken wide open, forcing them to question why they had always accepted such inequality. The flight crew, once calm and composed, now buzzed in a flurry of panic, unsure of how to regain control of the situation. Some tried to intervene, offering hurried apologies and asking Maya to sit down, as though compliance was the only remedy. Others looked to Dalton for direction, as if his status would somehow calm the growing unease. But it wasn't Dalton who could ease the tension, it was Maya's words. As the confrontation lingered, some of the passengers, their discomfort turning to introspection, found themselves questioning their own actions or inactions over the years. Had they, too, let authority dictate their sense of justice? How many times had they been silent when witnessing something wrong, just because it came from someone with power? The flight crew's disarray only amplified the chaos, their panic a silent admission that they, too, were aware of the seismic shift happening before them. And in the midst of it all, Dalton stood there, humiliated, his typically polished demeanor unraveling before the eyes of every passenger. For a man who had spent his life climbing the ladder of status, whose name had been synonymous with wealth and influence, there was a raw vulnerability in the realization that he, too, could be made small in the face of truth. His words faltered, his usual confidence stripped away as the cabin grew silent, save for the occasional murmurs from those watching, waiting to see how the situation would unfold. Finally, as the plane began its descent toward the airport, there was a shift in the atmosphere, an unspoken understanding that lingered in the air, thick with the weight of what had transpired. While Dalton remained silent for the remainder of the flight, the passengers and crew had been forever changed. The event had left a mark on them, forcing each of them to confront their relationship with power, authority, and their own biases, whether they wanted to or not. As the plane landed, the tension did not simply evaporate. Maya, though exhausted, felt a quiet sense of triumph, not because she had won a battle, but because she had ignited something far more important, a conversation. For the first time in years, the passengers, the crew, and even the CEO himself were left with questions that could not easily be dismissed. The final resolution, though not one of clear-cut victory, had planted the seeds of change. It was a reminder that even in the most unlikely places in the midst of a flight, with a man accustomed to controlling every room, change could come. The interaction would echo long after the plane touched down, making everyone reflect on the structures they had blindly upheld and the ways they had allowed authority to define their reality. Maya's act of defiance, though simple in its execution, had forced the world around her to stop and reckon with its own reflection. As she walked off the plane, her head held high, she didn't know what would come of it, but she knew one thing for certain: the conversation had started, and there was no turning back. The CEO, for all his humiliation, had left an impact on those who had witnessed the incident, just as Maya had left an imprint on him, a realization that no one, no matter how high they climbed, was immune to the consequences of their actions. The door had been opened, and though the future was uncertain, it held the possibility of change not just within the airline, but within the larger social structure. And that, for Maya, was enough.